She said I was wasting my life while zipping up a suitcase I didn't know she'd packed. The zipper's hiss was louder than her words, more honest, too. Her voice carried pity, not anger, as if I were some underachieving ghost she could finally stop pretending to see. I didn't argue. Just watched the way her hand trembled slightly at the handle. That told me more than anything she'd said in months. She expected me to beg. Or explode. Maybe both. But I stayed silent, letting the weight of that moment settle in the room like smoke. I need to start fresh, she said, glancing around the living room like it was already someone else's. I nodded once, slow. It wasn't resignation, it was calculation. Because 2 hours before she said that, I'd signed the final documents on a deal I'd spent a year engineering behind closed doors. $47 million in valuation, full equity. My name on every patent. She didn't know, and I wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. She walked out the door dragging her luggage like a body, heels clicking on the hardwood with too much confidence. I closed the door behind her with a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. It wasn't grief. Not yet. It was silence. Cold, clean silence. I stood there a long time, just listening. We'd had dinner the night before. Lasagna from the freezer, microwaved into limp submission. She wore an old hoodie of mine, said it was comfortable, which I'd once thought meant something. Now I saw it as camouflage. She kissed my cheek goodnight like someone clocking out of a shift. I didn't sleep. That night, I lay awake thinking about the way she'd started locking her phone, the calls she took outside, the bank statement I glimpsed 2 weeks earlier showing an $8,300 debit labeled personal retainer. It had scratched at me ever since. Now it screamed. That morning, after the door clicked shut behind her, I walked into my office and opened the folder I'd been keeping on my private drive. I hadn't gone looking for betrayal at first. I'd gone looking for answers to why the woman I'd married had turned into someone who looked at me like I was drywall. But once I started pulling threads, they kept unraveling. That bank withdrawal was the first one. Then a second, smaller one. Both from our joint account, both routed into an account I didn't recognize. I told myself it might be something innocent. A lawyer helping her mother. A deposit on a writing retreat. She'd always said she wanted to write a book. But then I found a hidden PayPal email in her autofill settings. The name didn't match hers. Or mine. But the address? Local. Just across town. The same part of town where she used to run errands on Thursdays. I opened my laptop and started pulling browser histories, cross-referencing every digital breadcrumb I'd saved since the tension started. Every lie she hadn't meant to tell. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just cold. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. And I had a feeling it was going to cost more than $8,300. By noon, I had the paper trail spread across 3 monitors and a yellow legal pad filled with notes in my own handwriting, blocky and sharp from the pressure I hadn't realized I was using. Names, dates, account numbers, IP addresses. The PayPal account was linked to a man named Marcus D. Rowan. The name rang a bell, but I couldn't place it right away. A LinkedIn search brought up a profile with a smug headshot, too white of a smile, too vague of a job description. Strategic Growth Consultant. That phrase usually translates to, I failed at 3 startups and now help others fail slower. But what caught my eye was the employment history. 2 years ago, he'd worked for me. He lasted 6 months, ambitious, talkative, reckless with protocol. I remember pulling him into my office once for accessing a proprietary file outside of policy. I told HR to let him go quietly. No scandal, just a misfit cut loose. Now he was buying $8,300 worth of something from my wife. I stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the backyard. The patio furniture was still there from last summer, gray with pollen. She'd always hated that table, said it looked cheap. Funny thing is, she chose it. It was almost absurd, how normal everything looked. Her coffee mug was still in the sink. Her side of the bed still held the shape of her last morning. The neighbor's dog barked at nothing. But under the surface, the lies were thickening. I went back to the screen. Her cloud backup hadn't logged out properly on one of our old iPads. She'd forgotten it even existed, tucked in a drawer beneath board games we hadn't played in years. Through it, I accessed her Sync Notes app. Buried between grocery lists and journal fragments was a locked folder. I knew the passcode. It was our anniversary date. She was either sloppy or arrogant. Maybe both. Inside were 7 notes. One caught my eye. Meeting recap MDR. That's when my pulse kicked up a gear. The note was short. Bullet points. Clinical. NDA signed. Pitch deck reviewed. Potential investment, $150,000 from Alex, via Julie. Confirmed. He hasn't told anyone about the deal yet. We could dismantle him gradually if needed. I reread the last line 5 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because it stripped something fundamental from my spine. That wasn't frustration. That was war planning. In shorthand, there were more notes. Legal asset review, separation timeline, exit narrative, failure angle. She had drafted it like a story, and I was the protagonist of the downfall she was crafting in silence. I wasn't dealing with heartbreak. I was dealing with betrayal dressed in project management. I printed the notes and locked them in my private safe, called my lawyer and told him to initiate the steps we'd discussed in theory but never put into motion: asset restructuring, trust protection, corporate firewalling. Then I opened a drawer in my office, pulled out a flash drive labeled Nova Deck V6, the same deck she referenced in her notes. My confidential pitch for a product that hadn't been announced, let alone shared. Somehow Marcus had it, which meant she'd given it to him. I sat there for a while, not thinking, not feeling, just adjusting to the shift in gravity. She didn't just leave me. She'd been tunneling under the house before walking out the front door, and I'd smiled at her while she did it. The first rule of war is simple: don't move until you know the terrain. That afternoon, I became a cartographer of her deception. I spent 6 hours reconstructing the past 9 months. Calendar events, phone records, transaction histories, browser data, even security camera timestamps from our home system. She hadn't disabled them all. She thought wiping the cloud link from her phone was enough. She didn't realize the footage was mirrored to a backup NAS drive I kept offline. The first time Marcus showed up at our door was a Thursday in late November. I had flown to Dallas that day, confirmed by my airline receipts and the GPS history in my phone. She said she had a migraine that morning. Cancelled dinner plans. The footage showed them on the porch. He didn't enter the house. He handed her a document folder and leaned in just slightly, too close for casual. She hesitated, but then smiled. That haunted me more than anything, not the betrayal, but the smile she gave him. I hadn't seen that expression in years. I pulled up my business email archive and searched Marcus's name. The last correspondence was dated 8 days after that visit, a legal inquiry disguised as a friendly check-in. It hadn't triggered any alarms then. Now, it read like reconnaissance. I began building a timeline file, naming each layer clearly: visits, email crossover, bank movements, document sharing, departure prep. I sent a discreet message to Julian Strauss, my security consultant, and the only man I trusted with both digital integrity and human discretion. No details, just, need you to verify physical and digital breach vectors, full audit. Silent. Julian replied within the hour. On it. We'll loop you in with results by morning. Don't touch anything else. I stopped, took a long breath, and poured a whiskey, not out of stress, but ritual. I was entering a second life now. The life where you pretend everything's fine while the walls are covered in listening devices. The hardest part was the next evening. Dinner with my parents. I showed up at their house with a bottle of red, the same kind she used to bring. Mom asked where she was and I told her. She needed some time to herself. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the truth she deserved. They talked about the garden. About my father's upcoming minor surgery. I nodded, smiled, even laughed once. But inside I kept seeing that bullet point. We could bleed him slow. That was when it changed for me. That line became the dividing wall. Before it, there was confusion, maybe hope. After it, only clarity. They weren't trying to move on. They were trying to destroy me. And the best part? They thought I wouldn't fight. When I got back home, I opened the safe again. I looked at the notes. At the signatures. I matched Marcus's scrawl from an NDA copy with his name in her file. Confirmed. It was him. Then I opened the Nova pitch deck on my desktop. Page by page, I compared it to what Marcus had pitched in a recent investor forum. I found it online through a friend who tracks early-stage venture portfolios. He changed the name, rebranded the product, tweaked the layout. But the bones? All mine. Proprietary layout. Market angles. Data modeling. Even the tagline, a line I'd written in the middle of the night during a caffeine binge, was still there, stripped of its context but not its DNA. He wasn't just stealing ideas. He was staging a public birth of a product I'd conceived, planned, and built, and she was helping him midwife it. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. It wasn't just about the relationship anymore. This wasn't a story of a woman falling out of love. This was a covert operation, a hijacking. And now I had to decide, would I try to salvage anything from the wreckage? Or would I turn the wreck into leverage? Either way, I wasn't going to tell her I knew. Not yet. I wanted her to think I was licking my wounds while she pulled the trigger. Because when you're playing chess and the other side thinks you're already checkmated, that's when you tip the board. The next morning, I woke up before the sun and stared at the ceiling for an hour. Not thinking, just calculating. The numbers, the timelines, the exposures. There's something coldly beautiful about having truth on your side and still pretending you don't. Julian sent his report at 7:14 a.m. Subject line. Confirmed breaches priority high. He'd found it all. First, her email. She'd created a secondary alias, close enough to her name to pass casual scrutiny, but not close enough for legal visibility. Through it, she was forwarding documents from my secured business servers to a private Dropbox. Documents with embedded metadata that tied directly to my intellectual property, Nova's architecture, prototype diagrams, market analysis. Second, my office. A concealed USB logger had been installed on my desktop tower, hidden under the back panel. It had been capturing keystrokes and screenshots for months. Only someone familiar with the office's setup could have installed it. She knew exactly where I worked, when I stepped out, what I left unlocked. The implication wasn't subtle. She'd turned our marriage into an espionage contract. Julian was already working with 2 attorneys from my inner circle to draft cease and desist letters and prepare for an injunction. We couldn't tip our hand yet. We needed confirmation of monetary gain, investor contact, IP registration, then we'd move like thunder. But that meant I had to smile through the storm a little longer. That afternoon, I did something she wouldn't expect. I called her. She didn't answer. Of course not. But I left a message. Calm, even tone. I told her I was going to be taking a little time to reflect, maybe get out of the city. No bitterness. No accusation. Just distance. The kind of distance someone guilty mistakes for defeat. 5 minutes later, she texted back. I hope you find what you're looking for. No punctuation. No warmth. But it told me everything. She thought I was adrift. Exactly where she wanted me. Perfect. That night, I went to dinner with Adam Chase, one of my earliest investors and a man who, 5 years ago, said something that stuck. No one sees you coming until they're already bleeding. I didn't tell him everything, not yet. Just enough to draw lines. I might be looking to expand. Might be open to strategic acquisitions. I saw the gleam in his eyes. He smelled war and opportunity. I needed that reaction circulating. Because the real war wasn't public yet. But soon it would be. I drove home through the rain, tires hissing on pavement, the windshield a blur of water and streetlight. I was bone-tired but wired. This wasn't a sprint. It was a siege. And I was digging in. Back home, I logged into the old cloud drive again, just to check. She'd uploaded another note. New title. Contingency if he fights. I opened the note slowly, expecting venom. Some final shred of bitterness, maybe an insult carved into bullet points. What I found was worse. It was a strategy, clinical, rehearsed. The first line read, emotional instability angle. Beneath it, frame as burnout/mental decline. She had even added a prompt in parentheses, cold and calculated. Preempt with therapist reference, Dr. Keller? My stomach turned as I kept reading. If it comes to court, I can pivot to emotional toll angle. And then the last line, underlined. Use his silence as proof. I stared at those words, numb. Not only had she planned to strip away my work and leave with my future in her pocket, she had rehearsed a narrative where I was the unhinged one. The silent husband. The emotionally distant failure. Her silence wasn't self-protection, it was strategy. She wasn't just going to rob me. She was going to frame me as compromised, unreliable. Like I wasn't in control of my own life. The lie was already half-written, and my silence, my patience, was the very evidence she planned to weaponize. I sat at the desk a long time, staring at that final line. Use his silence as proof. She didn't realize that silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is just the tension before everything changes. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Not after reading that note. By morning, I'd shifted fully from analysis to execution. Silence had bought me time, but time wasn't enough anymore. I needed action, silent, precise, and irreversible. First, I called Dr. Keller. She was real, a couples therapist we saw twice, 3 years ago. It didn't end badly. We simply stopped going. I requested a formal summary of our sessions and had it sent directly to my attorney. She'd never made a single note suggesting emotional instability. On the contrary, her reports praised my composure. Next, I called Julian again. I need to see everything she's registered, business entities, DBAs, investment accounts. I don't care what name she's using. He didn't hesitate. Already ahead of you. You're not going to like it. 3 hours later, I was staring at documents that made me feel like I'd stepped into a different life. She hadn't just joined Marcus's operation, she'd co-founded it, quietly registered under a Delaware LLC 3 months ago. She used a mailing address in his name and created an executive title for herself, Chief Strategy Officer. I cross-referenced the digital deck they were shopping around with my Nova files. The theft was complete. My market research, the proprietary structure, even the tagline lifted directly from my prototype slides. I'd suspected she was feeding him information. I hadn't realized she'd become him in every pitch. Then came the final blow. She and Marcus had signed a joint operating agreement. In the clause labeled Founder Equity, she was listed as majority partner. And there it was. The full picture. She hadn't walked out to find herself. She'd walked out to become me, without the years of sweat, failure, risk, or debt. She wanted my future without my past. I met with my legal team the next morning. We filed a formal cease and desist, an IP violation claim, and we began preparing a preliminary injunction. But we held off on serving them. I wanted them to feel safe, just a little longer. Because there was still one loose thread I couldn't ignore. Julie. The name had appeared in one of her notes. Potential investment, $150,000 from Alex, via Julie. I knew only one Julie with access to capital like that. Julie Patel, former venture analyst, a friend of hers. Someone I'd once mentored for a summer. I reached out casually, requesting a meeting under the pretense of pitching something new. She accepted. We met at a cafe near the Riverwalk. I brought no files, just questions hidden in pleasantries. It took less than 10 minutes before she slipped. So, you and Marcus. That's a surprise, she said, swirling her coffee. I didn't blink. What do you mean? Well, I mean, I assumed you were the technical guy and he was the face. But I guess now you're, what? Strategist? I smiled slowly. Something like that. Her eyes darted, realizing her mistake. She thought I was part of their pitch. That meant Marcus and my wife had sold my product using my name. It wasn't just theft anymore. It was identity fraud. I left the cafe in a strange kind of calm. Not relief. Something sharper. Like clarity forged from flame. They weren't just trying to take what I built. They were trying to take me out of it entirely. The worst part? It might have worked, if I hadn't been watching. I served them both on a Tuesday. The papers landed like a sudden power outage. Disruptive, final, and impossible to ignore. A uniformed courier delivered the injunctions to Marcus's newly rented office space. Simultaneously, another agent slid an envelope into her hand as she exited her yoga studio, where she'd been rebuilding her new life on borrowed breath and stolen equity. They had 48 hours to cease all operations, remove any and all materials derivative of the Nova platform, and prepare for depositions, IP violations, corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary trust. I made sure every charge had teeth. I didn't hear from either of them directly, but I didn't need to. Marcus's lawyer reached out the next morning, oily and overconfident, claimed their work was inspired by but not derivative of anything I built. I forwarded him the metadata timestamps, the forensic digital trails, and the login evidence showing the exact moments my confidential files were accessed under her alias. He didn't respond after that. She called me 2 days later. Not from her number, she used a blocked line. I let it ring twice before I picked up, said nothing. Just let her speak into the silence. What are you doing, Alex? Her voice was small, almost tremulous. I could hear wind in the background. She was outside. I pictured her pacing. I saw the papers, she said. This isn't. It doesn't have to go this way. Still, I said nothing. This isn't what you think, she added quickly. Marcus exaggerated things. I never meant. You falsified documents. You took what I built. You tried to erase me from my own future. And you crafted a story designed to make me look unfit if I defended myself. Silence. I have everything, I continued. Every note, every email, every recording. Do not insult both of us by pretending this was an accident. She exhaled hard. I didn't mean for it to go this far. That made me laugh, quiet and bitter. It only went as far as you pushed it. Then she tried the final move. We were broken, Alex, long before Marcus. You never. I hung up. The fallout came fast. The startup Marcus tried to launch collapsed within days. Investors withdrew under the shadow of litigation. His reputation, already shaky, turned toxic. Word spreads fast in tech, especially when theft is involved. She tried to shift the story, claimed she'd been misled and pressured. But I released select communications through my lawyer, a curated drip of damning evidence, not enough to humiliate her publicly, just enough to make her legally radioactive. Mutual friends, those who hadn't already picked sides, began to ghost her. The silence was no longer mine. It belonged to her now. The divorce moved quickly after that. She had no leverage left. I offered terms that were generous, considering what she'd done. I needed it over, not vindictive. She tried once more, through her lawyer, to argue for a share of the Nova valuation. As a former spouse with emotional support contributions, my lawyer responded with a single attachment, her exit plan notes, complete with the phrase, "Bleed him slow." She never mentioned equity again. 2 months after the dust had mostly settled, I received a letter. Not email. Not a call. A printed envelope, hand-delivered to my office receptionist with no return address. Inside was a legal notice. She was suing me. Not for defamation. Not for financial damages. For emotional distress. The filing accused me of emotional manipulation and a pattern of dominance hidden behind restraint. She claimed my silence during the final year of our marriage was a form of passive cruelty. That she'd been. Claimed she was driven to a point of emotional exhaustion, and had to leave to preserve her well-being. It was a bold play, almost impressive in its shamelessness. But the most chilling part wasn't the accusation. It was the attached exhibit list. She had repackaged every moment of restraint, every decision not to confront, every move I made to protect myself, as evidence of her oppression. And it might have worked, if she'd been careful. But in her rush to reframe the story, she overlooked the digital fingerprints that had already condemned her. She didn't realize I'd been recording everything. That my silence hadn't been passive, it had been protective. I passed the notice to my attorney. "We counter this," he said, flipping through the pages. "Not just to shut it down, but to make it expensive, time-consuming, public if we have to." But I had a different idea. The next morning, I filed a countersuit, not only refuting her claims, but exposing her attempt to use the legal system as a weapon. It wasn't about clearing my name anymore. It was about setting precedent. Her entire strategy depended on perception. I was done playing quietly. Then, through a private intermediary, I arranged a meeting. Neutral ground. Conference room. No press. No lawyers yet. She arrived late. Dressed in neutral tones, understated makeup. She looked tired. Not the fatigue of guilt, but of losing control of a story she thought she could write alone. I didn't stand when she entered. Just watched her take a seat across from me. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. I didn't answer. She looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the wood grain like she was trying to distract herself from her own words. When she finally spoke, her voice barely carried across the space between us. "I made mistakes," she said, not meeting my eyes. I didn't flinch. "Mistakes don't come with six-figure planning and forged documents." The words left my mouth steady, measured, cold truth, not rage. Her mouth pulled tight, jaw clenched as if she were chewing on a lie she didn't have the courage to swallow. Then she muttered. I panicked. "No," I said. "You strategized. You built a plan. You executed it. And then, when it failed, you pivoted. That's not panic. That's predation." She stared at me, eyes narrowing. "You think you're the hero here?" "No," I said. "I think I survived you. And I'm still standing." She didn't reply. After a long pause, she said, "What do you want?" I stood up, placed a single sheet of paper in front of her. It was a settlement offer. If she withdrew her emotional distress claim within 24 hours and agreed to a permanent NDA about our marriage, I'd drop the countersuit. No publicity. No courtroom. Just a closed door and a quiet ending. She read it twice. Didn't speak. Then she signed. She thought I was behind her when she walked out. What she didn't realize was, I'd already passed her long before she packed that suitcase. The silence she misread as surrender was simply preparation. And when I finally broke it, I did so on my terms, with precision, with control, and without ever raising my voice.